In this demonstration, we'll cover the use of formulas and functions in Microsoft Excel. So let's open up this example worksheet, and if you notice, it's a very simple grade sheet for 5 different quizzes where we have the 5 different grades down here in these 5 cells here. Over on the right hand side, what we'd like to place in this cell is the sum of those 5 numbers. In here we'd like to place the average, and in this cell the count, here the minimum, and here the maximum. So let's start with the sum. How do we add up those 5 different numbers? The one way that you may think is the best way of doing it is to type in a formula. And if you recall, to type in a formula function, we'll first press the equals key to indicate that we're going to type in a formula. So to do a formula, we can do something like cell C2 plus C3 all the way up to cell C6. And if we hit enter, it's going to give us the right answer. You add up those 5 numbers, you're going to get the number 35. But as you can imagine, this might not be the best way of doing things, because if you did have 20 or 30 quizzes or 20 or 30 numbers to add up, you don't want to have to write a very long formula. You don't want to have this taking you 15-20 seconds to write. So what you would use is a function, because some of these functions are pre-built for you to use. You don't have to use just strict mathematical operators, pluses or minuses. So the function that you'd use, let's just first delete the contents of that cell, would be the sum function. So if we type in equals to indicate that we're going to type in a formula function, and we type in sum, and you'll notice as we type this in, as I type the first letter, it's going to show us all the functions that start with S. So if I want to scroll down, I can see all the functions starting with S. And down here, there is the sum in this list. If we type the next letter, it's going to show us only the functions that start with SU. And we'll type in sum. And if you recall from the lessons, to pass in arguments or parameters into this function, we use the opening and closing brackets. So I've typed in the opening bracket, and now it's actually giving us a preview down here in this little tooltip as to what it actually expects as parameters to this function. So in the case of the sum function, it will take a series of numbers, so number 1, number 2. The square brackets actually mean that's optional. You don't have to supply 2 numbers. You only really require just 1 number. And the dot 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 over here on the right hand side indicates that you can supply as many numbers as you want, and it's going to add them together. So the sum, we could do what we did with the formulas and actually put in each one of the individual cells if we want. We could put in C2, comma, C3 all the way up to C6, but again, that's going to take just as long as typing it in as a pure formula. Instead, we can actually pass a cell range instead. So if you recall from the lesson, to do a cell range, we type in the cell of the first, which is right over here, C2. We put in a colon, and then we type in the cell of the very last number that we want to add, and it's going to add everything between those 2 cells. So the last cell would be the cell C6. And you'll see as I type that in, it's actually highlighted the entire cell range in blue. And then to finish this function, I'd have to type in a closing bracket. And then we hit enter, and then we get the same number, 35, but it didn't take as long to type. If you wanted to do the average function, it's going to be very similar. We can use the equal sign, and the average function is just the word average. And we can pass in the same cell range, the C2 to C6, and the average quiz mark is 7. The count function is going to count how many occurrences there are of something within a cell range. So put in the same C2 to C6, and you'll notice that there's fill handles over here. So if we didn't want the C2 to C6, we can actually drag this cell range to somewhere else. And you notice over here as we drag that, the cell range adjusts over here. Let's just put that back to all 5 of them. And then the number of cells within that range is 5, meaning that there are 5 quizzes. If we want the minimum mark of the quizzes, there's a min function. And instead of typing in the cell range, we can actually just drag our mouse over here. That's another way of putting in the cell range. So just click on the first one and drag down to the last one and release your mouse, and it'll type it in for us. And the minimum quiz mark was 4, which is correct. And there's a max function to find the maximum. And the maximum quiz mark was 9. One other function that might come in handy is the today function. So to get today's date, we can just type in equals today. And we don't have to pass any parameters into this function because it doesn't need anything. It already has enough information. We want today's date. And we hit enter, and it gives us today's date. And that concludes this demonstration.